And welcome back to Mixed Media Live. We're back for another weekly live stream, another weekly live show. And I'm super excited for this one. We're going to be talking about some spicy topics, some hot takes. We are half trying a new format. Our interview fell through this week, but hopefully next week we'll have the full format in. If you like any part of it, please let us know. I love our podcast viewers out there. You guys are eating up the episodes lately. So shout out to our audio only people. Hopefully by next week, if I get enough time to get on it, we will also be live streaming audio only, not on Podbean. Podbean basically doesn't work. So Podbean, you got to fix that. But on Clubhouse. I've been doing some research, looking into Clubhouse, and I think it would be pretty hassle-less overall to also get on Clubhouse. So I'm kind of excited for that.
I didn't know there was Clubhouse streaming or for podcasts. I thought it was like more like chat rooms.
It is technically chat rooms, but I would route the audio essentially to the chat room. And people, I mean, we could even like do cool things where we pull people's voices in live, which. That I'm not promising for next. Yeah, that I'm not promising for next week. But you know, you could spontaneously have a comment to make. Raise your hand in Clubhouse, and I can maybe pull you into the stream very magically. But that is not something I'm going to promise right now. So what's this new format? So what are we going to do? So the way we're going to do this is actually first. For those of you who don't know the podcast, Mixed Media is a weekly live streamed podcast that we upload our episodes to our podcasting platforms and all of our other platforms every week. So we'll split this up into 3 segments and we'll post the final podcast there. But you can interact with us live. And what we do is we talk about art in all of its capacities. We have our particular interests that you can see underneath our names on the screen there, and we'll introduce ourselves in a moment. But we like talking about art philosophy, business of art stuff, the actual art itself, reviewing things, reviewing your things, arguing with the internet a lot, and our spicy hot takes and all that kind of stuff. So my name is Irving Nestor. I'm a film and media person. I love media entrepreneurship. I own a company called Ariella. You can check out my website at ariella.co. Don't have the hat on today, but I've got the shirt, which you can barely see, and it's pretty awesome. So you can check out my merch on my website.
Yeah, I'm Nathan. I'm a game developer and 3D modeler. Yeah, working on a couple of games.
Sweet. How many games are you working on simultaneously at this point?
It varies per time, but I always have a consistent one. It varies per time, but like I always have one that I'm consistently working on that'll hopefully be the one. If you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's just like it's hard, man. It's hard. I'm not. Hey, welcome back. I'm realizing that I'm not a level designer. It's like, I actually just don't like it either. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Ben, you're just in time to introduce yourself, though.
Okay. Well, I'm Ben Costello. I'm a flute player, flutist, flautist, whatever you want to call that, and a media composer. Enjoying the trials of live streaming a podcast.
Clearly. How was your first week of class? Both of you, actually.
Not bad. I would say it's my introduction to virtual schooling, which I don't like. It's like I don't even feel like I'm really doing anything. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of sitting in my room all day.
Yeah. Are your lectures like on Zoom or something like that, and then you just tune into them?
Yeah, the only thing I have in person is like playing in an ensemble, and we're playing like outside, but we haven't met yet, so.
Interesting. How about you, Nathan? How was your first week of school?
It's been interesting. Mine's also been online, but not because it was supposed to be, but because there was like massive flooding due to the big storm that just passed. So all the classes were canceled and put online. But before that, I got to actually go out and do things. That was interesting. There's an esports center at my school, which is interesting. Yeah, it's like a whole like room of computers, and you can just play whatever you want. And I got to take the bus because my campus is so large, which is a very strange concept. But yeah, I went all around to all the different campuses. So that's interesting. And yeah, it's kind of weird being like responsible for myself, you know, because like I was sitting in my dorm one time. And I was like, I'm kind of hungry. I just kind of sat there like, wait a minute, I have to get the food myself though. So like, yeah, that was interesting, but I guess somewhat fulfilling, right? It's like, oh, hooray, I'm like an independent person. I got food for myself. So yeah.
Yeah, you'll grow into it, and it'll be awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I guess without further ado, we'll just hop into it. As you guys trickle in, like I said, feel free to chat to interact with us as we speak about our topics. We love interaction. So if you will have a comment, you want to contradict what we're saying, or whatever interesting thing to say, or you just want to say hello, just hit us up in the chat, and we're listening, and we'll incorporate you into the podcast. Yeah, so Ben will start us off today.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Soviet music as kind of a political football being punted around in America. And, this is a topic that, like, if you're like a friend of mine in my family, you probably heard me talk about way too many times. But I haven't talked about it on this show yet. I felt like it would be a good time to do that. It came into my mind because I was reading an article for one of my classes this week by Alex Ross. And I'm going to start with who Alex Ross is in a second. But I can't stand Alex Ross. I know it's a really unpopular opinion in the musical world. So, but I'll get to that. But the article was from a portion of his book, which is not what I'm going to talk about, but it is the introduction to his book. But it just reminds me of some of this stuff that I don't like. So yeah, we've talked in a previous episode about art as propaganda, and this is kind of related, but instead of looking at I think in that episode we were more looking at art that was kind of created for a particular purpose, and whether that's propaganda or not. And this is kind of looking at it from the opposite, and music that was kind of written for itself, but which has sort of been thrown around as propaganda after the fact.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So, okay. So, like I said, I find that Russian music, particularly Soviet music, is kind of, as I said, uses a political football. Every side, uses it for what they want, and then when they're done, they'll punt it off to somebody else, and they'll kick it around too. Okay, there's not really any middle ground. Both sides are using it, and without really any respect for the truth of what Soviet music, what happened in the Soviet musical world, Soviet world in general. That bothers me on a lot of levels, because I think it does a disservice to the music, and it does a disservice to our audiences, and it does a disservice to music students. And I say that as restarting music school. So I'm again thrust into the Russian musical narrative, such as it is presented. And you'd think that some of these Cold War political issues kind of died after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they're quite alive and well. And if anything, what we see in music, I think, is reflected still in the way we think about Russia in general, not just in terms of the arts. All right, so I mentioned Alex Ross, so I'm going to start with him as kind of a prelude. I'm going to look at kind of three political uses of Russian music. Two of them are going to be about Shostakovich, and one of them is going to be about Popov, and he's a much lesser known composer. And we're going to start with him and Alex Ross, because it's kind of our little like prelude to the little more complicated issue. So Alex Ross is a writer. He is the music critic for The New Yorker. So very, kind of influential music writer in kind of more intellectual discourse, I'd say. And he's written a couple things, but his most significant book came out a few years ago. It's called The Rest is Noise, The History of Music in the 20th Century, which I own. And we had to read the introduction to that in one of my classes this week and talk about it. Okay, so overall, it's an okay book, but Alex Ross has a very political bent in his book. So he wants, not so much like a left and right sort of thing, but his bias is very much, he wants to present 20th century music, even if it's avant-garde, as being good and worthy of you listening to it. And to do that, he tries to paint a narrative, tries to paint a whole bunch of narratives about, personal stories about why the music is interesting or not interesting. And one of his big themes is that a lot of his music is interesting because of the political circumstances that it was created in, or just general historic circumstances. So one of his big cases is, of course, Shostakovich. Like I said, I'm going to get to him in a second. But what irritates me most about what he says about Shostakovich is actually what he says about this other composer, who's a contemporary of Shostakovich, Popov. And Popov was same class as Shostakovich at the Petrograd and then later Leningrad Conservatory. And Popov studied with Shcherbachov, who is the teacher that Shostakovich wanted to study with. Shostakovich was, a great admirer of this kind of forgotten composer. But when he got to the conservatory, they assigned him to Steinberg, and Shostakovich hated Steinberg. So Popov is kind of, from the beginning of his career, kind of linked to Shostakovich, same age, same year, but studying different teachers at the conservatory. And beginning their careers at the same time. And both of them write very interesting first symphonies. Shostakovich is maybe a little bit more tonally traditional than Popov's, but it's still pretty kind of a wacky first symphony, kind of a really like grotesque kind of piece. Okay, and Popov's First Symphony is a lot more avant-garde, and his teacher Shcherbachov was a little bit more avant-garde of a composer anyway, which is part of why Shostakovich wanted to study with him instead of the kind of traditional Steinberg. The Popov's is a little bit more adventurous harmonically, not quite atonal, but it's kind of like on the edge of what was avant-garde in the late 1920s. Popov did a lot of other things too. He wrote some really significant film scores. But at the same time, they both experienced repression during the Great Terror in about 1936 to 1939 approximately. Ross, in his narrative, tells us that after that, he says that Popov's First Symphony is a masterpiece of 20th century music, and that after the repression, he becomes an alcoholic and could never write anything of significance again. Whereas he says that Shostakovich, perseveres through this repression and deadly time in Russian history, and emerges as a stronger composer on the other side. So that's important to Popov for his kind of giving us his narrative of, look how terrible repression is, but how special Shostakovich's music is, because Shostakovich had enough personal strength to, persevere through maybe the greatest tragedy of the Soviet era.
Really random fun fact for you guys out there, but if you look up Shostakovich, he kind of looks like Ben, just a little bit.
Most people say he looks like Harry Potter.
Oh, interesting. I can see that.
Yeah,
too.
Like a young Shostakovich looks like Harry Potter.
Yeah.
So that's part of his narrative, right? That Popov's music becomes irrelevant. He had been like this, promising great model for the 20th century, and he fails. Shostakovich writes great music, but it's more conservative after that. Okay, so I take issue with that because how many people in America have ever listened to Popov?
I have not.
You know what? I'll be honest. It's probably, you can probably count them on your fingers. Okay. It's a different story in Russia. So Alex Ross may have listened to some of these pieces. Alex Ross, I don't know that. I'm going to assume he's not just making up that he thinks these pieces are bad. But the average reader of this book has not ever heard of Popov before. And when you read that, you're going to go into anything that you listen to by Popov with that coloring your opinion. That's just, to me, that's he's using Popov as kind of his political tool to advance his own narrative that, you know, Stalin was a brutal dictator, which, yes, that's absolutely true. But, you know, you had to be like a special person to persevere through that and to create great art. I mean, look, I think Popov's later works are better than his first symphony. They're more traditional, yes, but I think they're really great examples of the Russian tradition in the later, you know, mid 20th century. What, you know, how could like the music of Rimsky-Korsakov and Tchaikovsky evolve but still stay within that kind of mold? So I really like Popov's Second Symphony, Fifth Symphony, Sixth Symphony, really great pieces, in my opinion. And does Ross explain why he thinks these are bad? No, he just tells us that Popov never wrote anything good again. Okay, so that's sort of a brief prelude to, you know, Soviet music being used for one's political agenda without really regarding the music itself. And you can feel free to disagree with me. If you got, you know, anyone who's listening to this, go listen to Popov, and you can say that his music is bad and his first symphony is better. That's fine if you feel that way. To me, even if you think that Popov's later music is worse, it's just he's not a political tool to be like, well, you know, look what happened because of these political consequences. He became an alcoholic. I don't know where I got that information from, but I'm going to throw that out there. And look, of course, it affected how bad his music is.
It's like, is that strategy called like poisoning the well or something like that? There's like a name for that kind of thing.
Yeah. So maybe the bigger case is Shostakovich. And so I briefly kind of mentioned who I kind of introduced him there a little bit. Shostakovich is my favorite composer, probably the most impactful composer, you know, for me. And he, in some ways, is probably maybe the most popular 20th century classical composer. Okay, but it's a quite interesting story of how he kind of achieved his current reputation in America. And I want to kind of go through that pretty, you know, not dwell too long on it, but I want to keep this short. We could probably talk about this for days. So Shostakovich, you know, was born 1906, died in 1975. He's a 11-year-old kid at the beginning of Russian communism, at the, you know, Bolshevik Revolution, dies towards the end of the Soviet era, but not before it, you know, it's still around when he died. So he kind of lives through, you know, pretty significant change. And he's, throughout basically the entirety of his career, hailed as the great Russian composer, both internationally and at home. Kind of, you know, he's as a teenager kind of preordained to carry on the legacy of you know, Tchaikovsky and all the other great Russian composers. His music is very it changes quite a bit over his career. Maybe not in the most obvious ways. Well, I'm gonna use, so his great friend and the guy who conducted the premieres of most of his pieces, Ravinsky, he calls him in an interview he gave after Shostakovich's, or I guess slightly before Shostakovich died, he calls him Istiny Well, that's a piece. Okay, so he basically says that he's a chronicler of his own life and the reality of life in the Soviet Union. Okay, so that's what Urbinsky calls him. So Shostakovich, so he starts off his career, like I said, hailed in Russia and abroad as the great Russian composer, even from the time he's a teenager. But things kind of change as attitudes towards communism in America and in the West generally shift. And in particular, every time we get to World War II, he's seen as being just writing propaganda, and his music is devoid of any value. This is reinforced by a very important figure, kind of hidden figure in American musical history, a guy named Nikolai, or as he went by in America, Nicholas Nabolkov, who is, I think, the nephew of the great writer. So he's a significant figure because he is the music advisor to the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom. Okay, so the CIA had set up this in secret thing called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which their job was to spread artistic free ideas to Russia in order to subvert the hold of communism.
Scary.
And he's their musical advisor. He's also the musical advisor and the to the JFK's inner circle. So he has a direct impact
also
on
scary.
two speeches that JFK gave on artistic freedom, contrasting artistic freedom in the Soviet Union and America. Okay, so he's a very influential figure who's kind of in the shadows.
As such people dwell.
Yeah. Well, I know the first time that I heard about the CIA having this kind of involvement in essentially spreading our American artistic propaganda to Russia. I mean, that's kind of crazy. Like, growing up, you think like the KGB does kind of sketchy stuff, but like, but we're doing the reverse kind of thing too. We're literally like printing copies of Dr. Zhivago and bringing them into Russia and distributing them on the street, things like that.
No, Ben, the CIA is the good altruistic. They just assassinate people and influence societies, and they would never do anything terrible to anyone, of course.
So this Congress for Cultural Freedom, they really wanted to bring like the most avant-garde things they could to Russia, and the hope that this would like make artists be more avant-garde and subvert Soviet regime. Okay, so again, just to be clear, like I'm quite against the Soviet regime. I want to be really, really clear about that. I'm not a like, one of these people. You can see people walking around in Russia with their shirts that said like, well, at least Stalin defeated Hitler.
Oh, that's pretty nuts.
There's kind of a resurgence of respect and love for Stalin in Russia. So I'm not one of those. I'm definitely not one of. But it's interesting that these sort of things, these cultural things occurred. Okay, so Nicholas Nabolkov met Shostakovich in 1949 at the World, I think it's the World Summit for Peace or something like that. I don't remember the exact title. This is a meeting in New York, and at this point, Shostakovich has faced his second official denunciation, but under this guidance of the cultural, basically the head of Minister of Culture, Zhdanov, who does not like a lot of composers, including Shostakovich, and so Shostakovich has to, formally apologize for his music and renounce all the ideas that were contained within them until Zhdanov and Stalin died a few years later, and that ban was lifted. So that happened in 1948, and they sent him in 1949 to the United States as their representative, one of their representatives at this international gathering. First, he asks Shostakovich from the crowd, when they're giving questions to the different speakers. He asks him point blank, "Do you regret denouncing your works?" Which is a terrible question to ask someone who is, sent there by the government and is not free to answer as he would. Okay, so of course Shostakovich says, "No, I don't regret it," and this really helps fuel the narrative of Shostakovich as being a slave to the government. Nabolkov writes this article where he basically he describes Shostakovich. He says he's not a free man, but an obedient tool of his government, and this has enormous impact on the American reception of Shostakovich. So that's kind of narrative number one about Shostakovich, and this is feeds into, of course, the idea that communism is our enemy, especially 1949. This is when that the Cold War is really beginning and heating up. We've defeated Hitler, and now the next enemy is our former ally by necessity, Russia. So that feeds into that political narrative that these poor artists like Shostakovich, they can't write anything of value because they're slaves, obedient tools to their government. There's a counter movement to this. And this begins a bit, well, there are probably other people who help reevaluate this, but the main person who helps bring about a reevaluation of Shostakovich's music in America is Leonard Bernstein. And so I want to say 57, but it may have been 1959, he leads the New York Philharmonic on a tour of Russia. And he plays Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony with Shostakovich in the audience. And, he meets Shostakovich. Shostakovich thanks him for, it's great that, at this point, knowing how relations are between our countries, that an American orchestra is going to play my music. So then Leonard Bernstein comes back, and he kind of decides he's going to spread the reverse political gospel on Shostakovich, in which Shostakovich is persecuted, but his music is really great. And here's the key, okay? It's really great, not just because it's immediately broadly popular stuff, but here's how I can fit this in with how much we hate Russia here in the Cold War. It's got all these secret messages in it. And this is alive and well today. Go to a music school, look in your music history curriculum that all your future musicians are getting. Go to a program, read, something was a concert that, don't go to a concert these days, because there probably aren't many in-person concerts now, but if you listen to a concert that has Shostakovich's music on it, read the program notes, or just look at the titles of these things. Like maybe 3 years ago, there's a program with Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra did, with Marin Alsop conducting it, who is Leonard Bernstein's last student. She's carried on his torch. The title of that was, I think, I might be paraphrasing slightly, but I believe it was called Hidden Codes or Hidden Messages, Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. And she gave a pre-concert talk about decoding. She definitely used the word decoding all the hidden things in Shostakovich's symphonies, as if there's a hidden code in the music. Okay, and Bernstein, tries to prove this by he takes the end of Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, and he plays it really fast. And he says it's supposed to be played really fast because it's like 32 straight measures of the orchestra playing the note A, then the brass playing this melody on top of it. And it's kind of a triumphant ending. But Bernstein says, well, it's so artificially fast, it just sounds really hollow. And what it is this is the sound of a man rejoicing, but only rejoicing because he's being beaten on the head with a stick, being told to rejoice. Well, maybe you feel that way about the music, but if we are going to look at the music itself, why don't we look at how the music is actually played by Mravinsky, the guy who, like I mentioned him earlier, was Shostakovich's close friend, the person who conducted the premiere of this work, which came out during the Great Terror, conducted it the rest of his life, and actually was kind of in the room helping, working on a lot of the details as Shostakovich composed this piece. Okay, so Mravinsky plays this more than twice as slow as Leonard Bernstein. In fact, when Leonard Bernstein played this piece in Russia, played with that fast ending, of course, Shostakovich, thanked him for playing it. Then the next day after Bernstein left, he writes in the press, "It was a terrible rendition of my symphony. The end is, ridiculously fast. It's not what it's supposed to be."
Ooh, rip.
So even if you buy that, wow, that it's so fast, it sounds so artificial, well, that is not what the piece sounds like, okay? And this is a significant piece. I mean, when this piece came out, the premiere of this, it resonated with people regardless of this. Okay, people widely reported that almost the entire audience was in tears at the premiere of this piece. Okay, so it's not like he needed some kind of hidden political message. But if you want to look in your, the music textbooks that your young future performers are getting, as they're being educated on Shostakovich before they go and perform him for you, they're being told, I can test this firsthand, Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony is him giving the middle finger to Stalin. Literally, that is a quote that every music student gets. Okay, look, whatever you feel about Russian communism and Stalin, whatever Shostakovich felt, which we do know, okay, and that's conveniently ignored. But however he felt or you feel, okay, the music does not explicitly do that. Okay, it's a piece of music. He's not making some kind of hidden political statement in it. The other example of a hidden political statement that we get is from towards the end of Shostakovich's life, a writer, Volkov, decides he is going to interview Shostakovich and then write down all of these things, all of Shostakovich's recollections on his life and music. Volkov is a pretty discredited person. He did the same thing with this Russian poet Brodsky towards the end of Brodsky's life, but he made the mistake of publishing it right before Brodsky died. And Brodsky reads this and says, "I didn't say any of those things."
Dang, that's pretty crazy. Someone's willing to lie about
Why would he do that while he was alive?
Right. So he waited. Luckily, with Shostakovich, he waited until after Shostakovich died. But this book, called Testimony, is the single most important book in Shostakovich literature, even though it is widely discredited for many reasons. I mean, you can take a course on how it is inaccurate. And in this, Shostakovich allegedly says that the second movement of my 10th symphony is a portrait of Stalin. That is kind of the narrative. Now, this book, Testimony, launches the Shostakovich Wars because Volkov is also kind of like Bernstein, trying to, fight back against this narrative that Shostakovich is a quote, obedient tool of the government. And so he wants to say that not only, it was Shostakovich's music, like secretly does it have secret Stalinist messages, but I mean, Shostakovich is really a truly hidden communist dissident. He doesn't like communism, and he's he's fighting the system from within. He was fighting the system from within. That is sort of the general debate that anyone who wants to go past the surface level of the dominant narrative now, which is that Shostakovich had all these secret messages in his music, the next level is the Shostakovich Wars. Literally, it's the name of a scholarly debate ignited by Volkov, which is basically asking how is Shostakovich, was he really a dissonant? What are these messages that he has in his music? How did he really feel about these things? Again, he's kind of being thrown around by both sides. He's either thrown around as an example of look how terrible communism is and trying to be an artist under communism is, or wow, he really hates communism and he's a great kind of champion of American values. And that's why we should love his music. The thing is that neither of these narratives are really true. If you dig into Shostakovich's life, and you can, the answer is pretty clearly that Shostakovich was a big supporter of the idea of communism, which makes sense. A lot of people in the Soviet Union were supporters of the idea of communism. Was he a fan of Stalin and and others' implementation of it? No. I think that's pretty obvious. Okay, but that doesn't fit in with either narrative. So we're doing a disservice to the music and the composer and to history by kind of simplifying these things with Cold War or anti-Cold War attitudes. Or I guess they're both Cold War attitudes. They're kind of different sides of the Cold War attitude. And to me, this sort of stuff gets to the kind of essence of like, what is music about? Does a composer, even if he wanted to, would a composer say, wow, this is a portrait of a political figure, if they weren't asked to write that? And I think the answer is no, generally. I think most music, at least in my opinion, there are obviously counterexamples to this, but most music kind of arises from it arises from circumstances of your life, but you can't express how it does. Ironically, Leonard Bernstein's kind of mentor and friend, Aaron Copland, in the beginning of, I can't think of the name of his book off the top of my head, but he says basically, does music have meaning? And Copland says yes, and he says, but can you express it in any number of words? And the answer is no. You can't put words to what it means. And a composer wouldn't do that, even if most composers wouldn't do that, even if they could. So do I think that Shostakovich's music is a reflection of his life and of the reality of life under the circumstances in which he lived, which are, obviously quite bad, living, in the Soviet Union, which, again, really bad repression and a lot of really terrible things that most people don't even know that happened. I think it's a reflection of that. But like Marinsky said, he's the chronicler of his life and of his reality, but not in explicit terms. So, I don't think we should be on the lookout for secret codes in music. Or I don't think we should just generally. I think we need to figure out a way to just generally reckon with Soviet music itself. Right? If you want to listen to Popov, don't think of him as just a purely a political result of political repression. And I'm going to, think of him only in terms of some kind of pre-constructed narrative I want to give about 20th century music, like Alex Ross did. Like, just evaluate Popov's music for what it is. Listen to it, without that idea of a narrative. Just listen to Shostakovich's music. Acknowledge that he's a complex person who's neither like a, secret American patriot, nor was he, a slavish disciple of Stalin. I think that the more complex reality is more beautiful for the music anyway. And I understand it doesn't sell very well, especially because unfortunately a lot of classical music audiences are older who, spent their lives in the Cold War, early part of their lives in the Cold War, and so his attitudes are appealing, and you put that on your programs, advertise your pieces, your concert with decoding secret messages of Shostakovich's symphonies. You're going to get more people to pay attention to your concert and show up. But again, I just think we're doing disservice to our music students, our audience, and the composers themselves.
Now, I have listened to Shostakovich, basically because of you. Yeah, and I remember one thing that I came away with was a lot of passages felt sarcastic to me. And I don't know if that was just, it was one of the first times I've ever heard something that sounds sarcastic musically speaking. I don't know if that has anything to do with this discussion at all, but I just think that's novel, at least to me. And
oh yeah, well, whether that's truly relevant to this or not, I don't know. I will say that you've kind of like come up with one of the best adjectives for a lot of his music, and I spent, well, you probably remember at least to some extent, although I wasn't around that much for it, but I wrote that 150-page senior thesis trying to quantify how his music fits that adjective in by actually looking at the notes themselves, and that was quite an endeavor. But I think that's one of the most immediately striking things about his music, and you're like, well, but how do you actually quantify that in terms of
what actually makes it sarcastic? I couldn't like really tell you.
and that's really the trap too of studying him as a if you're not studying him from the perspective of theory, because you know what it sounds like, but you can't exactly put into words how it achieves that effect, but it does. I personally think that's less related to this. I mean, I think it's related in that I think it's he actually uses in his 13th symphony, he takes a poem by a poet, Yevtushenko, who basically second movement is titled Humor, and he talks about how humor is this unkillable personified person. All these tsars and emperors tried to kill him, but you can't kill humor, and humor is like the only way you survive these terrible times. So I mean, I think it's part of his self-defense mechanism, but also he's just a humorous person. Like, even if you listen to his early music, like in the early 1920s, like his first symphony, which is mostly what my paper was about, he's very much inspired by this 1830s, 1840s writer Gogol, who's a very kind of fantastic, flights of fancy, kind of humorous, sarcastic writer. So he's kind of, and like he was known to just like the entirety of Gogol's works, memorize and just quote all of them. So I think in some ways that's also what you're seeing with the sarcasm in his music. Yeah, that's basically my version of Soviet music being tossed around by different political sides for different political aims.
Yeah, and I would just have to add that this Cold War sort of lens over things does not end with music sphere. It's surprisingly still in a lot of different aspects of the way we view the world. It's just people don't know the context, so they don't understand how old Cold War mentalities. I mean, if you think about even when the Cold War ended, right? It wasn't even that long ago. So, in the relative history of history, it wasn't too long ago. So, this sort of Cold War mentality does seep into other things as well. Definitely in film too, it's a little overblown and maybe tired too.
Can we get a film about a Russian who's not like, especially, can we get like a non-Russian dancer who's also a spy kind of thing? Like, it's attractive, deadly spy for Soviet Russia. Can we avoid that, please?
The Russians are always the enemies in video games.